January 30th, 1944. The Anzio beachhead, Italy. Behind the concrete walls of a German command bunker, Hauptmann Vera Hoffmann pressed himself against the cold, reinforced wall, his pencil trembling as he tried to record what he had just witnessed through the observation periscope. The words came slowly, each one feeling inadequate to describe what he had seen. "The Americans possess artillery of unimaginable power," he wrote, his handwriting unsteady. "Bunker Louisa no longer exists." Through the smoke and dust that hung over the battlefield like a funeral shroud, Hoffmann could see the crater, a massive wound in the earth where Strongpoint Louisa had stood for 8 months. The bunker, engineered to Wehrmacht standards and rated to withstand direct hits from 210mm shells, had been deleted from existence by a single round from an American super-heavy gun firing from beyond visual range. 32 men of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division had vanished along with tons of concrete and steel, erased as thoroughly as if they had never existed. The weapon responsible was making its combat debut with the 697th Field Artillery Battalion, the M1 240mm Howitzer, and what Hoffmann and thousands of German defenders would discover in the coming months was that every assumption about fortification warfare had become obsolete overnight. The United States Army had deployed a weapon that could transform the strongest bunker into a tomb with mathematical precision, and this is the story of how American industrial might, engineering innovation, and tactical doctrine converged to create a weapon that would terrify an entire army and help bring down the Third Reich. This is a World War II history documentary about the thunder that broke the fortress walls of Nazi Germany. Before we dive deeper into this untold story of World War II, if you're fascinated by military history and the technological innovations that shaped the Second World War, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love hearing from history enthusiasts around the world. Now let's continue with how America created a weapon that would change siege warfare forever. The story of the M1 240mm Howitzer begins not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the offices and testing ranges of the United States in the years before America entered World War II. In 1940, as German forces swept across Europe demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of their combined arms doctrine, American military planners were conducting a sobering assessment of their own capabilities. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department had commissioned a comprehensive study of American artillery, and the conclusions were stark and deeply troubling. The existing American artillery inventory, they determined, could not defeat modern European fortifications. This wasn't a matter of tactical employment or crew training, it was a fundamental limitation of the weapons themselves. The largest gun then available to American forces was the 155mm Long Tom, a respectable weapon that had served with distinction in World War I. But against the reinforced concrete bunkers that had become standard in German defensive doctrine, the Long Tom could damage but not reliably destroy these positions. The Germans had learned bitter lessons from the static warfare of the Western Front in World War I, and they had spent the interwar years developing fortification techniques that could withstand everything the French and British could throw at them. The Maginot Line, that famous chain of fortifications along France's eastern border, represented one approach to modern defensive warfare. But the Germans had studied it carefully and developed their own philosophy of fortification that emphasized practical, economical bunkers that could be built quickly and in great numbers. These weren't the massive fortress complexes of an earlier era. They were reinforced concrete bunkers with walls 3 to 6 feet thick, carefully positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire, designed to shelter infantry and weapons from artillery bombardment and air attack. By 1940, as France fell and Britain fought for survival, it was becoming clear to American observers that any future ground campaign in Europe would eventually require breaking through such fortifications, and the United States Army simply didn't have the tools for the job. The Anzio landings, Operation Shingle, represented an ambitious attempt to break the stalemate in Italy by landing forces behind German defensive lines and threatening Rome from the south. The operation began on January 22, 1944, and initially achieved complete tactical surprise. American and British forces came ashore virtually unopposed, and quickly established a beachhead. But the German response was swift and brutal. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, recognized the existential threat immediately and began rushing reinforcements to contain the Allied beachhead. Within days, the Germans had transformed the hills surrounding Anzio into a fortress system with interlocking bunkers commanding every approach to the Allied positions. The German 14th Panzer Corps had years of experience in defensive warfare, refined through brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, and they understood how to turn terrain into a killing ground. They constructed observation posts on every high point, built reinforced bunkers for infantry and weapons, and created a defensive network that channeled any Allied advance into carefully prepared kill zones. The Alban Hills, dominating the landscape southeast of Rome, became the anchor of the German defense, a fortress from which they could observe every movement in the Allied beachhead and direct devastating artillery fire onto any concentration of troops or supplies. For the Allies trapped in the beachhead, it was a nightmare scenario, surrounded by German forces that could see everything and seemingly strike anywhere. Casualties mounted steadily from German artillery and air attack, and it became clear that breaking out of the beachhead would require eliminating those German observation posts and bunkers in the surrounding hills. Conventional artillery could harass these positions, but couldn't destroy them. Air power had limited effect against reinforced concrete bunkers, and infantry assaults against prepared positions were prohibitively costly. This was exactly the scenario that the M1 240mm howitzer had been designed to address. The 697th and 698th Field Artillery Battalions arrived at the Anzio beachhead in January 1944, bringing the first M1 240mm howitzers to combat. The Germans, watching from their positions in the hills, had seen many things during years of war. They had faced Soviet artillery barrages of unimaginable intensity on the Eastern Front, where hundreds of guns would fire simultaneously in bombardments that turned entire sectors into moonscapes. They had endured British and American bombing raids that had devastated cities and military installations, but they had never seen anything quite like what was about to happen. On January 30th, 1944, at 14:30 hours, the 697th Field Artillery Battalion prepared to fire the first 240mm round in combat. The target was a German observation post on the Alban Hills, a reinforced concrete bunker that had been directing artillery fire onto Allied positions for days. Forward observers had carefully plotted its exact location using aerial photographs and ground observation. The Fire Direction Center had computed the firing solution, accounting for temperature, humidity, wind speed, and a dozen other variables that affected the trajectory of a shell traveling more than 13 miles. At precisely 14:30, the order was given and the massive howitzer fired. The sound was unlike anything the soldiers at Anzio had heard before, a deep, earth-shaking boom that seemed to compress the air itself, followed by a crack as the projectile broke the sound barrier. The 360-pound shell arced high into the sky, reaching an apex of several miles before beginning its descent toward the target. The crew didn't see the impact. The target was too far away, beyond the range of direct observation, but forward observers watching through powerful optics saw everything. The shell struck the bunker directly, and the reinforced concrete structure simply ceased to exist. One moment there was a bunker. The next moment there was a crater and a cloud of dust. The round had traveled 23,000 yards, over 13 miles, and scored a direct hit on its first shot. The bunker, along with its observation equipment and crew, was gone. Major Herman E. Smith, commanding the 697th, understood immediately that something significant had happened. His unit had just demonstrated a capability that would change the nature of warfare at Anzio. In his unit history, written during the campaign, he documented the weapon's psychological impact with clinical precision. After our first day of firing, German prisoners reported complete demoralization in their units, he wrote. They spoke of earthquake shells that made the ground shake for hundreds of meters around impact. Many refused to occupy bunkers after witnessing our strikes, preferring to take their chances in the open rather than be entombed in concrete that offered no protection against these weapons. The mathematics of destruction at Anzio were precisely recorded by American forces who understood the value of detailed documentation. Over the course of the campaign, the 240mm battalions fired 2,847 rounds. They engaged 67 bunkers and fortified positions. Of those 67 bunkers, 61 were completely destroyed. That's a destruction rate of over 90%, an almost unheard of effectiveness for any weapon system. The average number of rounds required to destroy each bunker was 4.8. Think about that for a moment. 5 shells on average to eliminate a fortified position that might hold dozens of soldiers and weapons. The maximum range achieved during the Anzio campaign was 25,100 yards, nearly 14.5 miles, demonstrating that the weapon could reach far beyond the front lines to strike targets in the German rear areas. The German 715th Infantry Division's war diary, captured after Rome's liberation, provides insight into how the enemy experienced this new weapon. American super heavy artillery makes our fortified positions untenable, one entry reads. Losses from single shells exceed those from day-long conventional bombardments. Men who survived Russian artillery barrages cannot endure this precision destruction. This last observation is particularly significant. These were veteran soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front, where Soviet artillery operated on a scale that dwarfed anything in the West. The Soviets would concentrate hundreds or even thousands of guns to pulverize German positions with sheer volume of fire. But the psychological impact of the American 240mm was different and in some ways more terrifying. It wasn't the volume of fire, it was the precision. A German soldier in a bunker knew that Soviet artillery would blanket an area with shells, some landing close, some far, with survival largely a matter of luck and good engineering. But with American super-heavy artillery, individual bunkers were engaged with observed fire. Forward observers identified your specific position, computed a firing solution, and then dropped shells directly on top of you with unnerving accuracy. The bunker you had trusted to keep you safe became a target. And when the 240mm rounds arrived, there was no survival, no luck, no chance, just obliteration. The breakthrough at Monte Cassino in May 1944 demonstrated the 240mm howitzer's ability to crack the toughest defensive positions in the European theatre. Monte Cassino represents one of the most bitter and costly battles of the Italian campaign, a months-long struggle to break through German defensive lines anchored on terrain that seemed designed by nature for defense. The Gothic Line, the German defensive system in southern Italy, had held for months against repeated Allied assaults. The ancient monastery of Monte Cassino, perched atop a 1,500-foot mountain, dominated the Liri Valley and the road to Rome. German paratroopers had transformed the area around the monastery into a fortress, building bunkers into the mountainside, positioning machine guns to cover every approach, and creating a defensive system that had broken multiple Allied attacks. The first, second, and third battles of Cassino had all failed at tremendous cost. New Zealand, Indian, British, and American forces had attacked repeatedly, supported by massive air bombardment and conventional artillery, but the German defenses held. The bombing of the monastery itself in February 1944 had been controversial and largely ineffective, creating rubble that the German defenders used to improve their positions. By May 1944, Allied commanders were preparing Operation Diadem, a massive, coordinated offensive that would finally break the Gothic Line. But they knew they needed something more than what had been tried before. The 240th Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 8 M1 howitzers, joined Operation Diadem on May 11, 1944. Positioned near Marno in the Liri Valley, they could reach every German position along the Gothic Line. Their primary targets were the reinforced bunkers built into the mountainside below the monastery, positions that had resisted months of bombing and conventional artillery. These weren't field fortifications thrown up quickly under combat conditions. These were carefully engineered structures built by German combat engineers using the organization TOT, the Nazi regime's civil and military engineering organization. They had reinforced concrete walls, overhead cover capable of withstanding direct hits from conventional artillery, and were positioned to provide mutual support so that attacking one bunker would expose infantry to fire from others. British Major General Francis Tucker, whose 4th Indian Division had suffered terribly in earlier assaults on Cassino, witnessed the 240mm bombardment and reported in his after-action assessment that the American super-heavy guns achieved what months of bombing and conventional artillery had failed to accomplish. Each round that struck home eliminated a German strongpoint completely. The psychological effect on the defenders was decisive. They understood that nowhere was safe. This observation from an experienced British general who had fought across North Africa and Italy carries significant weight. Tucker had seen every form of modern warfare, from desert tank battles to mountain infantry assaults, and he recognized that the 240mm represented something genuinely new in military capability. The 240mm howitzers fired continuously for 72 hours during the breakthrough battle, expending 1,847 rounds. The crews worked around the clock in shifts, the physical demands of loading and firing the massive shells pushing men to the limits of endurance. The guns themselves heated to the point where cooling periods were necessary to prevent barrel damage. Supply trucks ran constantly, bringing forward the massive shells and powder charges needed to sustain the bombardment. Post-battle analysis conducted by American and British intelligence officers showed that of 43 major German bunkers targeted, 39 were completely destroyed. The 4 surviving positions had been abandoned by their crews after near misses. German soldiers interviewed after capture consistently reported that they had been prepared to die in their positions, but the arrival of the super-heavy artillery had broken their will to resist. One German officer from the 1st Parachute Division told interrogators, "We could accept losses from conventional weapons. That is the nature of war. But these shells that could obliterate our strongest positions made defense meaningless. We were not soldiers anymore, just targets waiting to be destroyed." The breakthrough at Cassino opened the road to Rome, but more importantly for our documentary's narrative about World War II military history, it demonstrated to Allied commanders across all theaters that the 240mm howitzer was not just another artillery piece, but a war-winning weapon that could solve tactical problems previously considered intractable. The effectiveness of the 240mm howitzer stemmed not just from its massive shell, but from the entire American fire control system that had been refined through years of combat experience across North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. The Fire Direction Center concept, revolutionary when introduced and now standard in all modern artillery operations, allowed unprecedented accuracy and coordination in a way that multiplied the effectiveness of every gun. Before the FDC system, artillery fire was largely decentralized, with individual batteries computing their own firing solutions and coordinating through relatively primitive communications. The American system centralized fire control, with trained personnel using graphical firing tables, slide rules, and meteorological data to compute firing solutions that accounted for dozens of variables. Forward observers equipped with SCR 610 radios could call for fire from positions miles from the guns, often positioned with frontline infantry units or even beyond friendly lines in observation posts. Their target locations were transmitted to the FDC, where trained fire direction officers and their crews would compute the precise elevation, deflection, and powder charge needed to place shells on target. Within 4 minutes of a call for fire, rounds could be impacting targets over 14 miles away. This speed and precision represented a quantum leap in artillery effectiveness. Consider what this meant in practical terms on the battlefield. A German unit advancing to attack Allied positions might be observed by a forward observer concealed in a building or tree line several miles from the front. The observer would radio the target coordinates to the FDC. Within minutes, before the German unit had even made contact with Allied forces, shells could be falling on them with devastating accuracy. There was no warning, no preliminary bombardment that gave away the coming attack. Just sudden, precise destruction arriving from beyond visual range. The time-on-target technique multiplied the psychological impact even further and represented one of the most psychologically devastating innovations in artillery employment during World War II. Multiple batteries firing from different positions at staggered times could coordinate their fire so that all their shells arrived on target simultaneously. A German bunker might receive 6 240mm rounds within a 2-second window over a ton of high explosive, arriving without warning. The technique required precise timing and calculation, accounting for the different flight times of shells fired from batteries at varying distances from the target, but when executed properly, it was absolutely devastating. The psychological effect cannot be overstated. There was no screaming approach of incoming shells that might give defenders a few seconds to seek cover. There was no gradual increase in intensity that might allow soldiers to mentally prepare. There was just instantaneous, overwhelming violence as multiple shells struck simultaneously. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas B. Hedkin, commander of the 245th Field Artillery Battalion, explained the American artillery philosophy in a 1944 report that has become a classic document in artillery doctrine. "We don't fire barrages in the old style," he wrote. "We conduct surgical strikes. A forward observer identifies a specific bunker. We compute the solution and we drop 1 or 2 rounds directly on it. The precision terrifies the Germans more than volume of firewood. They can endure bombardment. They cannot endure the certainty that any position they occupy will be individually targeted and destroyed." This represented a fundamental philosophical difference from other armies' approach to artillery. The Soviets relied on mass, concentrating enormous numbers of guns to pulverize target areas. The Germans used sophisticated counter-battery techniques and precision fire, but lacked the fire control systems and ammunition supplies to sustain operations. The British had developed their own effective artillery doctrines, but operated on a smaller scale than the Americans. The United States Army, drawing on its industrial capacity and innovative fire control techniques, had created an artillery system that combined precision, volume, and sustainability in a way no other army could match. 4 M1 240mm howitzers attached to 19th Corps participated in Operation Cobra, the July 1944 breakthrough from the Normandy beachhead that would finally break the stalemate and launch the Allied drive across France toward Germany. The Normandy campaign had bogged down in the bocage country of northwestern France, where every field was bordered by ancient hedgerows that had grown into massive earthen banks topped with dense vegetation. The Germans had transformed this terrain into a defensive maze, fortifying every crossroads, positioning machine guns and anti-tank weapons in hedgerows that channeled American attacks into kill zones. The 352nd Infantry Division, veterans of the D-Day fighting at Omaha Beach, had fortified every hedge and crossroads around St. Lo, creating a defensive system that had stalled the Allied advance for weeks. American casualties in the bocage fighting were mounting at an alarming rate, and there was growing concern that the campaign might bog down into a repeat of World War I-style attrition warfare. The 272nd Field Artillery Battalion brought their 240mm howitzers into action on July 24th, systematically destroying German strongpoints that had survived the massive carpet bombing that preceded Cobra. The bombing itself, conducted by thousands of American heavy bombers, had been devastating but imprecise, with some bombs falling short and causing casualties among American troops. The 240mm howitzers provided the precision destruction that air power couldn't achieve. Hill 122, the key terrain feature dominating St. Lo, was fortified with concrete bunkers built into the reverse slopes, positioned so that they were immune to aerial bombardment and difficult for conventional artillery to engage. Reverse slope positions are a classic defensive technique, positioning fortifications on the far side of hills so that attackers can't see them until they crest the hill, and artillery fire tends to strike the forward slope rather than penetrating over to the reverse side. Technical Sergeant Raymond Jones, Section Chief with Battery A, 272nd Field Artillery, later testified in unit interviews about the effectiveness of the 240mm against these positions. "We could see the Germans thought they were safe in those reverse slope positions," he recalled. "Our observer called in the coordinates from an observation post on a hill to the north, where he could see the reverse slope. We fired 3 rounds for effect, using high-angle fire to drop the shells almost vertically. When the smoke cleared, there was just a hole in the hillside where the bunker had been. The Germans had nowhere to hide from us. The psychological impact was immediate and profound, in ways that shaped the entire Normandy breakout. The German 3rd Parachute Division, elite troops who had fought at Cassino and knew what modern combat looked like, began abandoning prepared positions rather than face 240mm bombardment. These were not second-line occupation troops or overage reservists. These were Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers with a fierce reputation and high morale, and they were running from their positions. Their commander, General Richard Heydrich, was captured on July 31st and told Allied interrogators in a statement that was carefully documented, "Your super-heavy artillery made static defense impossible. My men, veterans who had never retreated, ran from their bunkers. They preferred to face your tanks and infantry in the open rather than wait in concrete tombs for your shells." This statement represents a remarkable admission from a German general known for his aggressive leadership and uncompromising defense. The fact that elite troops would abandon prepared positions, giving up the defensive advantages they had worked so hard to create, demonstrates the psychological dominance that the 240mm howitzer achieved. It wasn't enough to damage German positions or inflict casualties. The weapon created a psychological effect that made defense itself seem futile, forcing German commanders to abandon the tactical principles that had served them well in earlier campaigns and scrambled to find some way to fight that didn't involve static positions. The liberation of France proceeded rapidly after the Cobra breakout, but the war in Italy continued to grind forward against determined German resistance in terrain that seemed purpose-built for defense, and it was there that the 240mm howitzer would face perhaps its greatest test against the Gothic Line. The assault on the Gothic Line in northern Italy during autumn 1944 proved the 240mm howitzer's value in mountain warfare, demonstrating that the weapon could be effective even in terrain that seemed to nullify conventional artillery advantages. The Gothic Line, Germany's last major defensive position in Italy, was a masterpiece of military engineering that German forces had spent a year constructing. Unlike the Gustav Line, which had been built relatively quickly as the Germans withdrew north, the Gothic Line represented a methodical effort by German engineers to create a defensive system that exploited every advantage the terrain offered. The fortifications ran along the Apennine ridges in northern Italy, using the mountainous terrain to create positions thought to be impervious to artillery. The mountains themselves provided natural protection, with bunkers carved into reverse slopes and positioned in locations where conventional artillery would struggle to engage them. German engineers had used Organization TOT resources and Italian forced labor to build elaborate concrete bunkers, many of them multi-level complexes with ammunition storage, troop shelters, and firing positions all integrated into the mountainside. The 697th Field Artillery Battalion, veterans of Anzio and the drive to Rome, positioned their howitzers in the valleys below the Gothic Line in September 1944. The tactical problem they faced was significant. The German positions were on mountain peaks and ridges, often at elevations that made direct fire impossible. Conventional artillery firing on flat trajectories would hit the mountainside well below the German positions, but the 240mm howitzer's design included the capability for high-angle fire, elevating the barrel to steep angles so that shells could arc high into the air and then come down almost vertically onto targets. Using this technique, the crews could drop shells onto German positions carved into the reverse slopes of mountains, striking positions that were invisible to ground observers and nearly immune to conventional attack. The destruction of the Futa Pass fortifications demonstrated the weapon's capabilities in mountain warfare and provided a template for breaking mountain defenses. The pass controlled the main route to Bologna and ultimately to the Po Valley and northern Italy. German forces understood its strategic importance and had constructed elaborate bunker complexes using every resource available to Organization TOT, the Nazi regime's engineering organization that had built fortifications across occupied Europe. On September 16, 1944, the 697th began systematic bombardment of these positions, working methodically from one fortified position to the next. Private First Class Donald Matthews, an ammunition handler with the 697th, wrote home to his family in Ohio during the battle, his letter providing a soldier's perspective on the weapon's effect. "The shells go up so high they disappear into the clouds," he wrote, "then come straight down on the German bunkers like the hammer of God. The explosion shakes the entire mountain. We can feel it in the valley where we're positioned, several miles away. After we hit a bunker, there's nothing left but a crater. Sometimes we find body parts scattered across the mountainside, but usually there's nothing left at all." His letter, preserved in family archives and later donated to the National Archives, provides unflinching testimony to the destructive power of the weapon. The Futa Pass fell in 5 days, a remarkably short time for such a strong position. German casualties from bunker collapses exceeded those from direct combat with infantry, according to German medical records captured after the battle. The 4th Parachute Division's war diary, written by surviving staff officers and recovered by Allied intelligence, recorded the experience of being on the receiving end of this bombardment. American super-heavy shells penetrate overhead, cover previously thought adequate against any artillery. Morale is collapsing as troops refuse to occupy fortifications, understanding that the concrete we trusted to protect us has become a trap. This reversal is striking when you understand how much psychological importance German doctrine placed on fortifications. From the trenches of World War I through the bunkers of the Atlantic Wall, German military culture had emphasized the importance of prepared positions and the protection they offered. The fact that soldiers were now refusing to occupy these positions represents a fundamental shift in their tactical psychology. The systematic destruction of the Siegfried Line beginning in September 1944 represented the 240mm Howitzer's greatest contribution to Allied victory in the war and a demonstration of American industrial and tactical superiority that had profound strategic implications. The Siegfried Line, known to the Germans as the West Wall, stretched 390 miles from the Netherlands to Switzerland, comprising over 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, and fortified positions built between 1936 and 1940. This wasn't a continuous line of fortifications, but rather a deep defensive zone, sometimes stretching back several miles, with multiple layers of defenses designed to channel attacking forces into killing zones and provide mutual support between positions. The fortifications had been built during the late 1930s, when Germany was rearming in violation of the Versailles Treaty, but before the war began, representing the best pre-war German military engineering. By 1944, these positions had been partially neglected as Germany focused on the Eastern Front and the Atlantic Wall. But as Allied forces approached Germany's borders in the autumn of 1944, the Siegfried Line was hastily reactivated and reinforced. The 265th Field Artillery Battalion brought their M1 howitzers to the Siegfried Line near Aachen in September 1944. The fortifications they faced were formidable by any standard in military history. Type 10 bunkers had walls 3 to 4 feet thick, sufficient to resist conventional artillery. Command bunkers featured 8-foot thick walls and were essentially invulnerable to anything short of super-heavy weapons or sustained air attack with bunker-busting bombs. Infantry positions were arranged with interlocking fields of fire so that attacking one position would expose infantry to fire from multiple other positions. The Germans had spent years developing this defensive system, and it represented their best thinking on how to defend their homeland against invasion. The first major test came at the Schill Line, an extension of the Siegfried Line defending Aachen, Germany's ancient imperial city that Hitler had declared must be held at all costs for symbolic reasons. On October 8, 1944, the 265th began preparatory fires for the 1st Infantry Division's assault on Aachen. In 6 hours of sustained firing, they expended 238 rounds, an impressive expenditure that represented careful target selection and fire control, rather than indiscriminate bombardment. They destroyed 19 of 22 targeted bunkers, a destruction rate of over 85% that demonstrated the weapon's reliability and effectiveness even against the strongest German fortifications. Corporal Robert Williams, a forward observer with the 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, witnessed the bombardment from a position in a partially destroyed building on the outskirts of Aachen, and his testimony provides insight into how the weapon appeared to those who saw it in action. Each 240mm hit was like a small earthquake, he reported in his after-action statement. We could feel the ground shake even from our position several hundred yards away. Concrete bunkers, we'd been told, would take days to reduce, with conventional methods were gone in minutes. The Germans inside never had a chance to escape. Most died instantly from the concussion, even if the shell didn't penetrate their position directly. This last observation is significant. The destructive effect of the 240mm wasn't limited to direct hits. The massive explosive force created overpressure waves that could kill soldiers inside bunkers, even through several feet of reinforced concrete, rupturing lungs and causing fatal internal injuries without leaving external wounds. The pattern of destruction repeated across the entire Western Front as American armies closed on the German border. The 278th Field Artillery Battalion, supporting 5th Corps, destroyed 73 bunkers in the Schnee-Eifel region during December 1944, fighting in winter conditions that made fire control and logistics even more challenging. The 698th Field Artillery Battalion, operating near Metz, eliminated the fortress ring around that city in November 1944, firing over 3,000 rounds in 2 weeks of sustained operations that reduced fortifications the French had built in the 19th century and the Germans had reinforced and expanded. Metz had been considered one of Europe's strongest fortress cities, having withstood sieges throughout history, but the 240mm howitzers reduced its defenses in days rather than the months that historical precedent suggested would be necessary. The Vosges Mountains campaign of October to November 1944 presented unique challenges that tested American artillery doctrine and demonstrated the adaptability of the 240mm system to unconventional tactical problems. German forces had fortified the heavily forested ridges with bunkers camouflaged by thick tree cover, positions that were invisible to aerial reconnaissance and protected from conventional artillery by both terrain and vegetation. Forward observers struggled to identify specific targets in the dense forest, and even when bunkers were located, directing accurate fire onto them was complicated by the lack of clear reference points. The 265th Field Artillery Battalion developed new techniques for forest warfare that would influence artillery doctrine for the rest of the war. When proximity-fused shells were available, a relatively new innovation that used tiny radar sets in the shell nose to detonate the warhead at a preset distance above the ground, they could achieve airbursts above the tree canopy with blast effects penetrating downward onto bunkers below. When using conventional shells with impact or timed fuses, they employed what they called box and one tactics, a technique that sounds simple but required considerable skill to execute effectively. They would fire 4 rounds at the corners of a suspected position, creating a box pattern around the target area, and then fire 1 round directly in the center. The idea was that even if the exact position of the bunker was uncertain, one of the 5 shells was likely to score a hit or near miss, and the massive destructive power of the 240mm made even near misses effective. Master Sergeant Harold Anderson, Chief of Section with the 265th, described the technique in post-war interviews conducted for military history purposes. The forest made observation difficult, but the 240mm didn't need the same precision as smaller caliber weapons. Even a near miss would collapse bunkers through ground shock. The sheer force transmitted through the earth from the explosion was so immense that it could literally shake bunkers apart, even if the shell didn't score a direct hit. We'd fire our pattern, wait for the dust to settle, and the infantry would advance to find nothing but craters and bodies scattered through the trees. The technique proved effective enough that it was documented in field manuals and distributed to other artillery units facing similar challenges. The liberation of Strasbourg on November 23, 1944, was preceded by 240mm bombardment of the outer fortifications that ringed this historic city on the Rhine. The German 553rd Infantry Division had prepared to defend the city street by street if necessary, but they abandoned their positions after losing 12 bunkers in 90 minutes of targeted fire from 240mm howitzers positioned across the Rhine. The speed of the collapse surprised Allied commanders who had anticipated days of house-to-house fighting. Post-war analysis by United States Army engineers, conducted as part of the systematic effort to understand what had made the 240mm so effective, revealed the technical reasons why the weapon proved so devastating against fortifications. The concrete-piercing shell, designated M17, used a hardened steel cap backed by 360 pounds of mass traveling at 2,300 feet per second at impact. This delivered approximately 2.8 million foot-pounds of kinetic energy, an almost incomprehensible amount of force concentrated on an impact area of less than 20 square inches. The resulting pressure, exceeding 200,000 pounds per square inch, surpassed any concrete's compression strength by orders of magnitude. But the shell's design was more sophisticated than simple kinetic penetration. The delayed fuse allowed penetration of 3 to 6 feet of concrete before detonation, meaning the explosion occurred inside the concrete mass rather than on the surface. The explosion inside the concrete created what engineers termed sympathetic fracturing, a cascading structural failure where shock waves reflecting off steel reinforcement created complex stress patterns that shattered entire structures from within. It wasn't just a hole punched through the concrete, it was the complete disintegration of the structural integrity of the entire bunker. The high explosive shell, designated M114, contained 49 pounds of TNT with aluminum powder additives that increased blast effect by 40% over pure TNT. This was a sophisticated explosive mixture that had been developed through extensive testing to maximize destructive power. When fused for surface burst, it created craters 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep in average soil, 30 feet wide and 12 feet deep in rocky ground. The crater effect alone could render defensive positions useless by destroying firing positions and blocking fields of fire. The deployment of 240mm howitzers required extraordinary logistical support that showcased American organizational capabilities and the industrial capacity that undergirded Allied military operations. Each battalion conducting sustained operations needed daily resupply of 50 to 100 shells, representing 18 to 36 tons of ammunition. They required 2,000 gallons of fuel for prime movers, generators, and support vehicles. They needed specialized maintenance equipment, including precision tools for barrel inspection and recoil mechanism servicing. They needed dedicated ammunition carriers with reinforced suspensions capable of handling the 360-pound shells without mechanical failure. The ammunition supply chain stretched from Watervliet Arsenal in New York to the front lines in Europe, sometimes covering 3,000 miles and crossing the Atlantic Ocean, where German U-boats still posed a threat to Allied shipping. Each shell required precision forging of the shell body from special steel alloys, machining to tolerances of 0.01 inches to ensure proper barrel fit and ballistic performance, careful filling with explosive compounds under controlled conditions, installation of precision fuses that had to function reliably under extreme forces, and individual inspection and proof testing before the shell was certified for combat use. By March 1945, as Allied armies prepared for the final offensives into Germany, the United States Army had stockpiled over 500,000 240mm rounds in European depots, representing an investment of resources that defied comprehension. Monthly consumption peaked at 35,000 rounds during the Rhine crossings, an expenditure rate that Germany, Japan, or even the Soviet Union could not match. This represented industrial capacity and logistical organization on a scale that only the United States could achieve, and it was this capacity, as much as any individual weapon or tactical innovation, that ensured Allied victory. The Rhine crossing operations of March 1945 demonstrated the 240mm howitzer at peak effectiveness, operating as part of the most sophisticated and powerful military machine ever assembled. Operation Plunder, Field Marshal Montgomery's meticulously planned set-piece crossing on March 23rd to 24th, was preceded by the largest artillery preparation of the Western War, a bombardment that involved thousands of guns from multiple Allied armies. American 12th Corps contributed 12 240mm howitzers to this bombardment, concentrating more super-heavy firepower than had ever been assembled for a single operation. The target was the Wesel fortified zone, where the German 84th Infantry Division had constructed elaborate bunker systems along the east bank of the Rhine. The Germans understood that the Rhine represented Germany's last major natural defensive barrier, and they had worked frantically to create fortifications that might slow the Allied advance. Beginning at 1700 hours on March 23rd, the 240mm howitzers began systematic destruction of identified positions. The firing plan was sophisticated, with each gun assigned specific targets based on aerial photographs and intelligence assessments. Captain William Morrison, commanding Battery B of the 278th Field Artillery Battalion, recorded the operation in his unit log with professional precision. "We had aerial photographs showing every bunker along our sector of the Rhine," he wrote. "Starting from the north, we worked our way south methodically, engaging each position with 4 to 6 rounds, depending on the target's size and construction. By midnight, we'd destroyed 31 bunkers and damaged 12 more sufficiently to make them unusable. The crossing met minimal resistance in our sector. German survivors reported complete demoralization after watching their fortifications disintegrate in a matter of hours. They had been told to fight to the death for the fatherland, but there was nowhere to fight from and nothing to fight with. The bunkers they had trusted were gone." The 84th Division's strength returns, German military records captured after the collapse, showed 2,400 casualties from artillery alone, and most of those from bunker collapses rather than from shell fragments or blast effects in the open. Soldiers had crowded into bunkers seeking protection from the massive bombardment, and the bunkers had become their tombs when 240mm shells found them. The encirclement of Army Group B in the Ruhr pocket, from April 1st to 18th, 1945, saw 240mm howitzers reducing industrial facilities that had been converted to fortresses, demonstrating the weapon's versatility beyond purpose-built military fortifications. German forces trapped in the pocket had fortified factories using reinforced concrete industrial structures as defensive positions, a creative adaptation to a desperate situation. Industrial buildings with their thick walls and complex interiors could be transformed into formidable defensive positions if properly prepared. The 698th Field Artillery Battalion supported the reduction of the pocket's northern sector, systematically eliminating these improvised fortresses. The Krupp Steel Works in Essen, Germany's premier armaments manufacturer that had supplied weapons to German forces throughout 2 world wars, had been fortified with additional concrete reinforcement and prepared for a final stand. The facility represented German industrial might and had symbolic importance beyond its military value. On April 9th, 240mm rounds transformed the main factory buildings into twisted rubble, destroying in hours what Allied bombing had failed to eliminate in years of strategic air campaigns. Staff Sergeant James Peterson, a forward observer with the 313th Infantry Regiment, witnessed the destruction from a position on a hillside overlooking the Krupp Works. "These weren't normal buildings," he recalled in post-war interviews. "They were industrial fortresses with walls 3 feet thick, designed to support massive machinery and built to last for generations. The 240mm shells went through them like tissue paper, collapsing entire structures and creating clouds of dust and debris that hung over the city for hours. The psychological effect on the defenders was total. They surrendered in masses after seeing what happened to the Krupp Works, understanding that if we could destroy those buildings, we could destroy anything." Army Group B, initially 430,000 strong, one of the largest German military formations still in the field, surrendered after just 18 days of encirclement. Intelligence reports compiled by Allied intelligence officers credited the rapid collapse partially to the systematic destruction of fortified positions by super-heavy artillery, which convinced defenders that resistance was futile and would only result in pointless death. When soldiers lose faith that defense is possible, military formations disintegrate rapidly, regardless of numbers or weapons. The Waterfleet arsenal's production of 240mm howitzers represented American industrial mobilization at its finest and deserves recognition as the achievement in manufacturing that matched anything produced during the war. The facility, established in 1813 on the Hudson River north of Albany, New York, had become America's premier large-caliber gun factory by World War II, employing thousands of skilled workers who took pride in their contribution to victory. Production statistics tell a story of increasing capability and efficiency. In November 1942, they completed 6 pilot models, test articles, that proved the design's feasibility. Throughout 1943, they produced 72 units at a monthly average of 6 guns, as production techniques were refined and the workforce expanded. In 1944, as demand increased and production hit full stride, they manufactured 158 units at a monthly average of 13 guns. From January to August 1945, before production ended with Japan's surrender, they produced 79 more units at a monthly average of 10. The total production was 315 units, each one a precision instrument of destruction that represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor. The workforce peaked at 9,100 employees working 3 shifts, 7 days a week, maintaining production around the clock to meet military demands. Women comprised 35% of the workforce, performing precision machining operations that military planners had previously considered impossible for female workers, shattering gender assumptions about industrial work and proving that women could excel at technically demanding manufacturing. The arsenal's monthly payroll exceeded $3 million in 1944, making it the Capital District's largest employer and a critical part of the regional economy. Each gun barrel required 65 tons of special steel, carefully formulated alloys that could withstand the enormous pressures and temperatures generated during firing. 847 individual machining operations were needed to transform raw steel into a finished barrel, each operation requiring skilled workers and precision equipment. 72 hours of precision boring created the barrel's interior, a process that demanded extraordinary accuracy to ensure consistent ballistic performance. Heat treatment in furnaces reaching 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit relieved internal stresses and increased the steel's strength. Individual proof firing with overpressure charges, test shots using deliberately excessive powder charges, verified that each barrel could safely withstand combat conditions. The quality control was exceptional by any industrial standard. Of 315 guns produced, only 2 failed acceptance testing, and both failures were due to minor recoil mechanism issues that were quickly corrected through design modifications. No M1 240mm howitzer ever failed catastrophically in combat, suffering a barrel burst or other mechanical failure that would kill the crew. This safety record, achieved under combat conditions where equipment was pushed to its limits, stands as testimony to American engineering and manufacturing excellence. American production of 240mm ammunition defied German comprehension and represented industrial capacity on a scale that the Axis powers could not match or even fully understand. Waterfleet Arsenal alone produced 2,000 rounds monthly by 1944, but this was only part of total production. Additional production at Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey and civilian contractors brought total monthly production to 10,000 rounds by early 1945. Each round represented a masterpiece of mass production that required sophisticated manufacturing techniques. The shell body was forged from 4140 chromium molybdenum steel, a specially formulated alloy chosen for its strength and machining properties. Machining to tolerances of plus or minus 0.01 inches ensured that shells would fit precisely in gun barrels and achieve consistent ballistic performance. Filling with 49 pounds of grade A TNT required careful procedures to prevent voids or imperfections in the explosive charge. Fitting with precision-machined rotating bands, copper rings that engaged the barrel's rifling to spin the shell for stability and flight, demanded exacting work. Individual gauging and inspection before rounds were certified for shipment meant that quality was maintained even at high production volumes. The logistics chain delivered this ammunition with remarkable efficiency, despite the challenges of transporting such heavy and sensitive cargo. Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that kept the Allied war effort supplied, carried 240mm rounds as deck cargo, with each ship transporting up to 500 rounds secured in specially designed cradles. The Red Ball Express truck convoys that maintained supply lines across France included specialized ammunition sections with reinforced vehicles designed to handle the 360-pound shells without damaging suspensions or cargo beds. By April 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, United States forces in Europe had expended 118,429 rounds of 240mm ammunition while maintaining theater reserves exceeding 100,000 rounds. This profligate expenditure, impossible for any other belligerent nation including the Soviet Union with its massive industrial base, multiplied the weapon's psychological impact. German soldiers understood that the Americans could fire these massive shells essentially without limit, that there would always be more ammunition, always more bombardments, always more destruction raining down on any position they tried to defend. Operating the M1 240mm howitzer demanded exceptional teamwork and physical endurance from crews who worked under conditions that tested human limits. Each 14-man crew functioned as a precisely coordinated team with every member essential to the weapon's operation. The crew positions were carefully defined through extensive training and combat experience. The chief of section, always an experienced non-commissioned officer, commanded the piece and bore ultimate responsibility for its operation. The gunner was responsible for laying the weapon, using sophisticated sighting equipment to achieve the precise elevation and deflection required for accurate fire. The assistant gunner operated the breech, the massive mechanism that sealed the rear of the barrel during firing. Numbers 3 through 8 were ammunition handlers who managed the backbreaking work of moving 360-pound shells from storage to the gun. Numbers 9 and 10 operated the M2 crane, the specialized lifting equipment needed to move shells and barrel components. Numbers 11 and 12 were powder handlers who managed the propellant charges. Numbers 13 and 14 were vehicle drivers who maintained security and operated the prime movers and support vehicles. Loading the weapon required extraordinary coordination that crews practiced until movements became instinctive. The 360-pound projectile was lifted by crane, a delicate operation given the shell's size and the need for precise positioning. 4 men guided it into the breach, using hand signals to coordinate their movements since verbal communication was difficult in the noise of combat. The shell was then rammed home hydraulically, pushed into the barrel using mechanical systems because human strength alone couldn't consistently seat such massive projectiles. The powder charge, up to 8 separate bags of propellant, depending on the desired range, was loaded behind the shell. The entire loading process took 90 seconds for a well-trained crew operating at peak efficiency, though combat conditions often extended this time. Private First Class Michael Sullivan, an ammunition handler with the 697th Field Artillery Battalion, who served through the entire Italian campaign, described the physical demands in letters home that were later preserved by his family. "After firing 10 rounds, everyone is completely exhausted," he wrote. "The concussion from firing is like being punched in the chest by an invisible giant. Your lungs compress and for a moment you can't breathe. We rotate positions every hour to maintain efficiency and prevent injuries from repetitive strain, but even with rotation, everyone is sore and exhausted by the end of a fire mission. What keeps us motivated is knowing what our shells do to German bunkers and how many American lives we save by eliminating obstacles that would otherwise require costly infantry assaults." The forward observers directing 240mm fire held one of the war's most dangerous jobs and deserve recognition for their courage and professionalism. Positioned with frontline infantry, or even beyond friendly lines in isolated observation posts, they identified targets and adjusted fire with lethal precision while exposed to constant danger. Lieutenant Robert Anderson, a forward observer with the 265th Field Artillery Battalion, survived 187 days in combat, an extraordinarily long period for someone in such a dangerous position. His personal record, meticulously maintained in a notebook he carried throughout the campaign, documented directing the destruction of 47 German bunkers. In a 1985 interview conducted by military historians, decades after the war, when he could reflect on his experiences with perspective, he offered thoughts on the moral weight of his role. Calling in 240mm fire was like summoning Thor's hammer from mythology, he said. I'd identify a bunker through my binoculars, radio the coordinates to the fire direction center, and minutes later watch it cease to exist in a massive explosion. The power was intoxicating, but also sobering. Each shell I called in might kill dozens of enemy soldiers who were just trying to survive like everyone else. I did my duty and I'd do it again, but I never forgot that these were human beings I was killing, not just targets on a map. The observer's equipment was sophisticated for its time, but primitive by modern standards. The BC scope provided 20 times magnification for target identification. The M1 plotting board allowed observers to compute corrections and maintain records of targets engaged. The SCR-610 radio was a 48-pound backpack unit that provided voice communication with the fire direction center. Map cases with aerial photographs helped observers identify and communicate target locations. Compass and rangefinder equipment allowed precise location determination. The psychological burden these men carried was significant and often lasted for decades after the war ended. Forward observers could see the human cost of their actions through their optical equipment, watching German soldiers flee bunkers, seeing the wounded trying to crawl to safety, witnessing the dead scattered across the battlefield. Many reported nightmares decades after the war, their sleep haunted by the faces they had seen through their scopes, and the knowledge that their voices on the radio had brought death to thousands. Captured German documents and post-war interviews with German veterans revealed the terror inspired by 240mm bombardment and provided insight into how the enemy experienced American firepower. The Wehrmacht's experience fighting the Soviets, where they had endured artillery barrages of unprecedented scale, had not prepared them for American precision firepower. Soviet artillery operated on principles of mass, concentrating hundreds or thousands of guns to pulverize target areas with overwhelming volume of fire. German soldiers had developed tactics and psychological coping mechanisms for surviving such bombardments. But the American approach was different and in many ways more psychologically devastating. A November 1944 report from the German 7th Army, captured at Metz along with other headquarters documents, stated with remarkable candor, "Enemy super-heavy artillery represents a new form of warfare for which our doctrine has not prepared us. Individual bunkers are engaged with observed fire of extreme accuracy. Casualties from single shells exceed those from day-long conventional bombardments that we have endured on the Eastern Front. The morale effect is catastrophic. Troops refuse to occupy forward bunkers, preferring to take their chances in the open where they at least have a chance to see incoming fire and seek cover." The German 19th Army defending the Vosges Mountains reported in captured documents that 60% of their casualties came from artillery, with 240mm fire causing disproportionate losses, despite representing only a small fraction of total artillery fire directed against German positions. Bunkers that had protected troops for months, positions that soldiers had come to trust and consider relatively safe, became death traps once American observers identified them and called in super-heavy fire. Post-war interviews with German veterans, conducted by military historians and researchers, consistently emphasized the psychological impact of 240mm bombardment. Former Oberstleutnant Hinrich Zinnmann, who commanded a regiment in the Siegfried Line during the autumn and winter of 1944-45, stated in a 1962 interview conducted in West Germany, "Regular artillery fire we could endure. We had learned on the Eastern Front to survive bombardments that would have broken untested troops. But those monster shells from the American super-heavy guns broke our spirit in ways that conventional artillery never could." When you saw a bunker simply disappear, when one moment there was a fortification and the next moment just a crater, you understood that nowhere was safe. Many of my men shot themselves rather than wait for the next shell to find their position. They preferred a quick death by their own hand to being buried alive in collapsing concrete or killed by concussion that would rupture their internal organs. This testimony to suicide among German troops speaks to the complete psychological breakdown that super-heavy artillery could induce, a level of demoralization that went beyond normal combat stress. The M1 240mm howitzer was part of an Allied super-heavy artillery force that included British and Soviet weapons, but American industrial capacity made the decisive difference in how these weapons affected the war's outcome. Comparative production figures tell the story starkly. The United States produced 315 M1 240mm howitzers. Britain produced 36 BL 7.2-inch howitzers, their closest equivalent weapon, though somewhat smaller in caliber. The Soviet Union produced 47 280mm BR-5 mortars, powerful weapons, but far fewer than American production. Germany produced only 8 examples of their 24-centimeter K3 railway gun, sophisticated weapons that required rail transport and were strategically inflexible. The American advantage lay not just in quantity, but in mobility and sustained operations that made the weapons tactically useful. While German and Soviet super-heavy guns required rail transport or extensive site preparation that limited their tactical flexibility, the M1 could be towed slowly by tracked vehicles like the M4 high-speed tractor and emplaced anywhere with suitable ground conditions. This meant American super-heavy artillery could support mobile operations rather than being tied to fixed positions or rail lines. British observers, who had extensive experience with artillery warfare from World War I through North Africa and Europe, consistently praised American super-heavy artillery in their after-action reports and assessments. Major General Sidney Kirkman, artillery commander for British 13th Corps during the Italian campaign, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The American 240mm howitzer achieved what our own heavy guns could not, the systematic rapid destruction of fortified positions with minimal ammunition expenditure." At Cassino, where British and Commonwealth forces had fought for months with limited success, these weapons were largely responsible for the breakthrough that finally opened the road to Rome. The Americans had solved the problem of mobile siege artillery in a way that exceeded anything we had developed. As Allied forces drove into Germany proper in early 1945, advancing across the Rhine and pushing toward Berlin from the west, the 240mm howitzer continued its destructive work against every German city, designated a fortress by Hitler's increasingly desperate orders. The Führer had ordered numerous cities declared Festung, fortress cities that must be held to the death regardless of military logic, and every one of these cities faced systematic bombardment by super-heavy artillery as part of Allied reduction operations. The siege of Aschaffenburg from March 25th to April 3rd, 1945, demonstrated the weapon's urban warfare capabilities in a medieval city that German forces had fortified with characteristic thoroughness. The German 36th Infantry Division, though understrength and composed largely of older reservists and young conscripts, had fortified the medieval city using its ancient architecture as the foundation for modern defenses. They barricaded streets with rubble and disabled vehicles, converted buildings into strong points with firing positions cut through walls, and prepared to defend every block. The 265th Field Artillery Battalion positioned 4 howitzers across the main river, giving them clear fields of fire into the city, and systematically destroyed defensive positions using forward observers who infiltrated close to German lines to identify targets. The precision was remarkable even in the complex urban environment. Forward observers could place 240mm rounds through specific buildings without causing significant damage to adjacent structures, using careful fire control and precise target coordinates. This selective destruction convinced many German commanders to surrender rather than see their cities leveled completely, understanding that continued resistance would only result in more destruction without changing the inevitable outcome. The capture of Nuremberg from April 16th to 20th, 1945, saw three 240mm battalions in action simultaneously, the largest concentration of super-heavy artillery employed against a single city during the war. The medieval fortifications, those ancient walls that had defined the city for centuries, had been reinforced with modern concrete by German engineers preparing for a final stand in this symbolically important city. The 698th Field Artillery Battalion destroyed 8 major bunkers in the old city walls in 4 hours of firing on April 19th, demonstrating that even the combination of medieval stone construction and modern concrete couldn't resist American firepower. When Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, ending the war in Europe, after nearly 6 years of devastating conflict, American 240mm howitzers had made a decisive contribution to Allied victory that military historians continue to study and analyze. The final statistics compiled by United States Army Ordnance tell a story of unprecedented effectiveness. Total rounds fired in the European theater of operations, 118,429. Bunkers and fortifications engaged, 3,847. Confirmed destroyed, 3,114, representing 81% of targets engaged. Damaged beyond use, 489, another 13%. The average number of rounds required per target destroyed, 3.8. Maximum range achieved in combat operations, 25,255 yards over 14 miles. Gun tube replacements required due to wear, 23 barrels across all guns in service. Catastrophic failures resulting in crew casualties from mechanical problems, 0. This last statistic deserves emphasis. Despite being pushed to operational limits, despite firing over 118,000 rounds under combat conditions, not a single M1 240mm howitzer suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure that killed its crew. This safety record represents American engineering excellence and quality control that saved countless American lives. The human cost inflicted by 240mm fire on German forces is harder to quantify precisely due to incomplete German records and the chaotic conditions of the war's final months. German military records, often incomplete as units were overrun or destroyed, suggest 15,000 to 20,000 casualties, directly attributable to 240mm bombardment, with psychological casualties that led to surrender or desertion, possibly doubling that figure. But statistics cannot capture the full impact of these weapons on German military effectiveness and morale. Combat experience with the 240mm howitzer led to continuous improvements in employment doctrine and procedures that increased effectiveness throughout the war. Early operations revealed that the 8-hour emplacement time severely limited tactical flexibility, tying the weapons to positions for extended periods. By 1945, experienced crews had reduced setup time to under 4 hours through improved procedures, including pre-positioned supplies, better coordination between crew members, and specialized equipment modifications. The development of mechanical fuse setters increased the rate of fire from 1 round per 3 minutes to 1 round per 2 minutes for sustained operations, a 50% improvement in firepower. These mechanical devices allowed faster and more reliable fuse setting than manual methods, reducing crew fatigue and increasing accuracy. Improved powder formulations developed by Ordnance Department chemists extended barrel life from 500 rounds between replacements to 800 rounds, a 60% increase that reduced logistics burdens and kept more guns in action. The most significant operational innovation was the integration of photographic reconnaissance with fire planning that transformed how targets were identified and engaged. By 1945, forward observers routinely received annotated aerial photographs showing every potential target with numbered grids, allowing rapid target identification and fire mission processing. This reduced mission processing time from 10 minutes to under 4, meaning that from the moment a forward observer identified a target to the moment shells were impacting, less than 4 minutes elapsed. This near real-time responsiveness gave American forces an enormous tactical advantage. While this documentary's narrative focuses primarily on European operations, where the majority of 240mm howitzers saw service, it's worth noting that these weapons also saw limited but significant service in the Pacific Theater. 6 weapons supported the Philippines campaign, destroying Japanese fortifications on Corregidor in February 1945. The island fortress, which had held out for months against Japanese siege in 1942 before finally surrendering, had been fortified by Japanese forces who understood its strategic importance guarding Manila Bay. The concrete-piercing shells proved especially effective against Japanese cave fortifications, a type of defensive position that had caused terrible American casualties throughout the Pacific War. The shells could seal cave entrances through blast effect and create concussion casualties deep inside mountains where Japanese soldiers had thought themselves safe from artillery. Plans had existed for extensive 240mm deployment in Operation Downfall, the proposed invasion of the Japanese home islands scheduled for late 1945. The United States Army had projected requirements for 100 howitzers to reduce Japanese homeland fortifications that intelligence assessments suggested would be far more extensive and sophisticated than anything encountered in the Pacific Islands. Japan's surrender in August 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, made Operation Downfall unnecessary, but captured Japanese officers interviewed after the war admitted that their defensive plans had not accounted for American super-heavy artillery capabilities, having assumed that logistics and terrain would limit artillery support for the invasion. Military historians examining the Second World War consider the M1 240mm howitzer a revolutionary weapon that fundamentally changed siege warfare and defensive doctrine, influencing military thinking well beyond World War II. Its combination of mobility, accuracy, and destructive power rendered traditional fortifications obsolete, forcing a complete rethinking of defensive warfare. The United States Army's official history, compiled by professional historians with access to all military records, concluded that the 240mm howitzer provided ground forces with a capability previously reserved for naval gunfire or strategic bombing. It could destroy any fortification with surgical precision, profoundly affecting both the physical and psychological dimensions of warfare. No defensive position, regardless of how well engineered or how much concrete and steel went into its construction, could be considered safe once identified by American forward observers. Soviet observers, given access to captured German fortifications as part of Allied cooperation in the war's final months, were particularly impressed by what American super-heavy artillery had accomplished. Marshal Vasily Chuikov, who had commanded at Stalingrad, where Soviet forces had learned brutal lessons about urban warfare and fortification reduction, examined destroyed Siegfried Line bunkers and commented in reports to Moscow. The Americans have found the solution to modern fortifications, not mass artillery fire as we employ, but precision engagement of individual targets. One American gun achieves what 100 of ours cannot, the complete destruction of fortified positions with minimal ammunition expenditure. We must study their methods carefully. This admission from a Soviet marshal known for his aggressive tactics and confidence in Soviet military methods speaks to how impressive American artillery effectiveness was even to experienced Allied observers. The terror inspired by 240mm bombardment left lasting psychological scars on German survivors that persisted for decades after the war's end. The German Veterans Association, formed in the post-war years to provide support for former soldiers, documented high rates of specific phobias among survivors of super-heavy artillery bombardment through medical studies conducted in the 1950s and 60s. Seismophobia, an abnormal fear of vibrations and earth movement, affected 73% of bunker survivors surveyed. Claustrophobia, fear of enclosed spaces, affected 67%. Phonophobia, pathological fear of loud sounds, affected 89% of veterans who had experienced 240mm bombardment. Dr. Hans Müller, a German psychiatrist treating veterans in Munich during the 1950s, identified what he termed bunker syndrome, a specific complex of psychological symptoms including recurring nightmares about being buried alive. panic attacks triggered by loud noises or vibrations, and an inability to enter concrete structures or underground spaces without experiencing severe anxiety. His research, published in German medical journals, suggested that the sudden, complete destruction of supposedly safe positions created unique trauma patterns different from other combat experiences. The psychological mechanism was clear. Soldiers who had trusted fortifications to protect them, who had been told by their officers and engineers that concrete bunkers could withstand any attack, experienced profound psychological shock when those bunkers were obliterated. The betrayal of that trust in supposedly safe spaces created trauma that conventional combat stress didn't replicate. American veterans also carried psychological burdens from their service with super-heavy artillery, though different from what German soldiers experienced. Forward observers reported recurring dreams about calling in fire missions decades after the war, their sleep disturbed by memories of watching bunkers explode and knowing they were responsible for the deaths inside. Gun crews described permanent hearing damage despite protective equipment, with many becoming partially or completely deaf in later life. The physical sensation of firing, the ground shock that made the earth tremble, the chest compression from overpressure, and the overwhelming sound that exceeded anything human senses were designed to process, remained vivid in veterans' memories decades later, triggered by thunderstorms or other loud noises. The successful deployment of 240mm howitzers represented American industrial philosophy at its most effective, embodying principles that defined the American approach to World War II. The philosophy was mass production of precision weapons, creating effective systems that could be manufactured in quantities sufficient to overwhelm enemy forces. While Germany produced individual masterpieces like the Carl Gerät 600mm mortar with only 6 built, or the Schwerer Gustav 800mm railway gun with only 2 built, weapons that represented extraordinary feats of engineering but had minimal strategic impact, America mass-produced effective weapons that were good enough to achieve military objectives and available in quantities that ensured victory. The comparison is instructive and reveals fundamental differences in how the combatant nations approached warfare. A German 600mm Carl Gerät required 24 hours for setup and could fire 1 round per 10 minutes under optimal conditions, with only 6 examples built during the entire war. An American 240mm M1 required 4 hours for setup by experienced crews and could fire 1 round per 2 minutes sustainably, with 315 examples produced. This represented fundamentally different approaches to warfare rooted in different national philosophies and industrial capabilities. Germany sought Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons that would provide decisive advantages through technological superiority, individual weapons so advanced that they could offset numerical disadvantages. America sought producible weapons that would provide advantages through quantity and reliability, systems that were technologically sophisticated but could be manufactured at scale. The 240mm howitzer program cost approximately $120 million in 1945 currency, including development, production, and ammunition manufacturing. This equaled the cost of 40 B-24 Liberator bombers, or 1,600 Sherman tanks, representing a major investment of resources. Yet the strategic impact, the ability to reduce any fortification quickly and support mobile operations, justified this investment many times over by saving Allied lives and accelerating the war's end. The M1 240mm howitzer's influence extended well beyond World War II, shaping Cold War weapon development and artillery doctrine for decades. Its success demonstrated the value of super-heavy mobile artillery, influencing Soviet, American, and other nations' weapons programs. The Soviet Union developed the 2S4 Tilepan 240mm self-propelled mortar during the Cold War, explicitly citing American World War II experience with super-heavy artillery as inspiration for the weapon's development. The fire control techniques developed for the 240mm, particularly the fire direction center system and the integration of aerial reconnaissance with artillery fire planning, became standard for all artillery, regardless of caliber. Modern GPS-guided munitions like the Excalibur artillery shell trace their conceptual ancestry to the precision fire missions of 1944 to 45, representing the same philosophy of precision engagement rather than area bombardment. Several M1 howitzers survive today as monuments at military installations and museums, preserved to honor the weapons service and the crews who operated them. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the U.S. Army's artillery center, displays serial number 14, which fired the first combat round at Anzio, a weapon with genuine historical significance. The WWII Arsenal Museum preserves serial number 1, the prototype that proved super-heavy mobile artillery was possible and paved the way for production models. These preserved weapons serve as tangible connections to a decisive period in military history and the innovations that helped win World War II. The M1 240mm howitzer achieved something rare in military history. It rendered an entire category of military architecture obsolete within months of its combat debut. For centuries, fortifications had provided defensive advantages in warfare, with each generation of fortification design responding to new offensive weapons. Concrete and steel bunkers represented the ultimate expression of this centuries-old philosophy. Fortifications that seemed capable of resisting any weapon except sustained strategic bombing. The 240mm howitzer ended that era decisively in 18 months of combat operations across Europe. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe and the architect of victory in the West, wrote in his post-war memoir, Crusade in Europe. The 240mm howitzer gave us the ability to crack any defensive position quickly and economically. It saved thousands of Allied lives by eliminating fortifications that would have required costly infantry assaults involving house-to-house fighting and high casualties. The weapon's psychological impact on German defenders was as important as its physical destructive power. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in Italy and later in southern Germany, offered the enemy's perspective in his post-war writings and interrogations. The American 240mm gun was a weapon against which we had no answer, he admitted. Our bunkers, built at enormous cost in materials and labor, using our best engineering principles, became death traps once American observers identified them. The psychological effect was devastating beyond anything we had experienced on the Eastern Front. Troops lost faith in any defensive position, understanding that concrete offered no protection against American firepower. This admission from one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders, a man who had delayed Allied advances for months through skillful use of terrain and fortifications, speaks to how completely the 240mm had changed the tactical equation. Behind the statistics and strategic assessments were individual soldiers whose service and sacrifice brought victory, men whose stories preserved in unit histories and personal memoirs humanize the mechanical destruction we've been discussing. Sergeant David E. Matthewson of the 697th Field Artillery Battalion served from Anzio through the war's end, participating in operations that destroyed over 100 enemy positions across Italy and southern Germany. In a 1990 interview conducted when he was in his 70s, he reflected on his service with a mixture of pride and somber recognition of war's costs. "We knew we had something special, a weapon that could change the battlefield," he said. "When the infantry called for us, we could eliminate obstacles that had stopped entire divisions. We took pride in that and in knowing we were saving American lives. But we also knew that every shell we fired might kill dozens of enemy soldiers, young men not much different from us who had families and dreams. It was necessary, and I'd do it again without hesitation, but it wasn't easy to live with. You don't forget the power you wielded." Lieutenant Harold Saunders of the 272nd Field Artillery Battalion directed fire during the Normandy breakout, his forward observer team spending 73 consecutive days in combat without relief. His personal records documented calling in missions that destroyed 31 German strongpoints, each one representing dozens of enemy casualties. "The 240mm was our ace in the hole," he recalled in a post-war interview. "When nothing else worked, when the Germans thought they were safe behind their concrete walls, we could reach out and touch them with precision that shocked them. It saved American lives, and in war that's what mattered above everything else. We were fighting to go home, and every bunker we destroyed brought us closer to that goal. These men and thousands like them, artillery crews and forward observers from small towns and big cities across America, operated weapons of unprecedented destructive power with professional precision and remarkable safety records. They transformed American industrial might into battlefield victory, one devastating round at a time, demonstrating that free workers in a democratic society could produce and operate weapons that totalitarian regimes could not match. German tactical doctrine evolved rapidly in response to 240mm bombardment, though no truly effective countermeasure ever emerged that could protect fortified positions. By late 1944, Wehrmacht defensive instructions issued to frontline units emphasized dispersion and camouflage over fortification, a complete reversal of decades of German military thinking. The German 7th Army's December 1944 tactical directive, captured when American forces overran the headquarters, stated bluntly, fixed fortifications must be abandoned immediately when American super-heavy artillery presence is confirmed in a sector. Troops should construct field positions that are frequently relocated, with overhead cover sufficient only for protection against conventional artillery and shell fragments. Bunkers concentrate casualties rather than preventing them when super-heavy shells are employed. This represented a complete abandonment of German defensive doctrine that had been developed over decades, refined through World War I trench warfare and years of fighting on the Eastern Front. The Prussian military tradition of elaborate field fortifications, the careful engineering that had characterized German defensive preparations, crumbled before American firepower in ways that shocked German commanders. Some German innovations showed tactical promise, but ultimately proved inadequate. Dummy positions heated with fires or stoves to simulate occupation sometimes drew fire away from actual positions, wasting American ammunition on empty bunkers. Smoke generators obscured observation and made precision fire more difficult, forcing American observers to wait for winds to clear the smoke. Electronic jamming attempted to disrupt American radio communications between observers and fire direction centers, though American signals personnel quickly developed countermeasures. But these were desperate expedients that could only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, summarized German frustration in post-war interrogations. "We could accept being outproduced," he said. "That was expected when fighting America with its enormous industrial base. But the precision of their heavy artillery, the way they could identify and destroy individual positions with such accuracy, made every defensive position vulnerable, regardless of its strength. We were not just outgunned but outclassed in every aspect of artillery warfare, fire control, ammunition supply, observer training, and weapon performance. Operating 240mm howitzers extracted a price from American forces as well, costs that are often overlooked when discussing weapon systems. Gun crews suffered extensive hearing damage that affected them for the rest of their lives. Post-war Veterans Administration studies conducted in the 1950s found that 90% of 240mm veterans had significant hearing loss, with many becoming partially or completely deaf in later life. The concussion from firing, that chest-compressing overpressure wave that crew members described as being punched by an invisible fist, caused chronic traumatic encephalopathy in some long-service crew members, brain damage from repeated concussive impacts that wouldn't be fully understood until decades later. Forward observers suffered the highest casualty rates of any artillery specialty, a grim distinction that reflected the danger of their role. Of 127 forward observers trained specifically for 240mm battalions, 31 were killed in action and 43 wounded, a combined casualty rate of 58%. Their exposed positions with frontline units and the high-value Germans placed on eliminating them, understanding that killing observers would blind American artillery, made survival unlikely over extended combat periods. Mechanical failures, while rare given the weapon's excellent safety record, could be catastrophic when they occurred. On March 3, 1945, a premature detonation in the bore of a 240mm howitzer near Prüm, Germany, killed 5 crew members instantly in a tragedy that shocked the artillery community. Investigation revealed a faulty fuse that had detonated the shell before it left the barrel, causing a barrel burst that sent fragments through the crew positions. This led to improved quality control procedures at ammunition plants and additional fuse inspections before loading. The logistical burden of supporting 240mm battalions was immense by any measure. Each battalion required 67 vehicles, including specialized prime movers, cranes, ammunition carriers, and support vehicles. Fuel consumption averaged 2,000 gallons daily when battalions were moving between positions. The weapon's weight, over 30 tons per gun, damaged roads and bridges not designed for such heavy loads, requiring engineer support to maintain supply routes and reinforce structures. The M1 240mm howitzer represented American warfare philosophy at its most effective, principles that defined how America fought and won World War II. Overwhelming firepower delivered with precision, backed by unlimited industrial production and sophisticated logistics, created military advantages that enemies could not counter. While individual German bunkers might have been stronger than their Allied equivalents, American industry could destroy them faster than Germany could build them, a mathematical certainty that rendered German defensive efforts futile. This industrial superiority terrified German commanders more than tactical defeat in individual battles. They could counter superior generalship with clever tactics, offset numerical disadvantages with superior training and veteran troops. But they could not answer unlimited precision firepower, backed by infinite ammunition supply and unbreakable logistics chains. The 240mm howitzer ultimately represented a manifestation of American industrial democracy, defeating European totalitarianism through material superiority. Free workers in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Watervliet produced weapons that destroyed fortifications built by slave labor, proving that democratic societies could marshal greater sustained power than dictatorships. The triumph was not just military but moral, demonstrating that freedom and democracy were not weaknesses but sources of strength that totalitarian regimes could not match. The German encounter with American 240mm howitzers was more than military defeat. It was psychological transformation through technological shock, the shattering of assumptions that had underpinned their entire military worldview. Soldiers who had believed in the supremacy of German engineering, in the impregnability of concrete fortifications, and the advantages of prepared defense, discovered that American industrial capacity had rendered their entire military doctrine obsolete virtually overnight. The numbers tell only part of the story. 315 howitzers produced, 118,429 rounds fired, 3,114 bunkers destroyed. The true impact was measured in the complete collapse of German faith in fixed defenses, the understanding that spread through the Wehrmacht that no position could be considered safe once identified by American observers. Every shattered bunker demonstrated American superiority, not just in firepower but in every aspect of modern warfare: logistics, production capacity, technological innovation, and military organization. The 240mm howitzer did more than destroy fortifications and kill enemy soldiers. It demolished the psychological foundations of German resistance, breaking the will to fight in ways that conventional weapons could not achieve. Wehrmacht soldiers learned to fear not just the shell itself, but everything it represented: unlimited ammunition supplies, precision fire control systems, mechanical reliability, and the terrible efficiency of American industrial democracy operating at full capacity. In the ruins of the Siegfried Line, among the shattered concrete and twisted steel reinforcement, lay not just broken fortifications, but the shattered remnants of Nazi Germany's military pretensions and its leaders' dreams of conquest. The thunder of the 240mm howitzer, echoing across European battlefields, was the sound of American industrial might, proclaiming inevitable victory in a war that totalitarian aggression had started, but democratic resolve would finish. Every German soldier who heard that distinctive deep boom understood its terrible meaning, though many tried to deny it until the end. They had challenged the arsenal of democracy, attacking a nation with the industrial capacity to outproduce the entire Axis combined, and they were losing that challenge in the most definitive way possible. The terror of super-heavy bombardment would echo long after the guns fell silent in May 1945. Veterans on both sides would spend decades trying to process the trauma. German survivors haunted by memories of watching their supposedly impregnable fortifications vanish in clouds of pulverized concrete. American veterans carrying the weight of the destruction they had inflicted. But from that terror came transformation, the recognition that the age of fixed fortifications had ended forever, and with it, any military doctrine based on static defense behind concrete walls. The M1 240mm howitzer had spoken with the voice of American industry and democratic determination, and its message was unmistakable to anyone who heard it. In modern industrial warfare between nations with different levels of industrial development, there is no defensive position that cannot be destroyed by a determined opponent with sufficient resources, no fortification that cannot be breached with enough firepower and ammunition, no bunker that cannot become a tomb when super-heavy shells arrive with mathematical precision. The Germans were not simply terrified when United States 240mm howitzers obliterated their fortresses in battle after battle across Europe. They were transformed by the revelation of American power that made further resistance genuinely futile, though Nazi ideology and fear of retribution kept many fighting until the end. In the final assessment, the greatest victory of the 240mm howitzer was not the thousands of fortifications it destroyed, or even the tens of thousands of enemy casualties it inflicted. The greatest victory was the minds it changed. German soldiers who had begun the war believing in their technological superiority and their nation's destiny, ending it with the understanding that they had been overwhelmed by an industrial democracy that could transform raw materials into precision weapons faster than totalitarian systems could build concrete walls to hide behind. The thunder of the 240mm howitzer was democracy's answer to tyranny, the sound of free people defending their values and their allies with weapons that represented not just military power, but the industrial and organizational superiority of democratic systems over totalitarian ones. This weapon, born from American engineering innovation and manufactured by American workers who understood what they were fighting for, helped bring down Nazi Germany and restore freedom to occupied Europe, one devastating shell at a time. The legacy of the M1 240mm howitzer extends far beyond its service in World War II, influencing military doctrine, weapons development, and our understanding of industrial warfare for generations. It stands as testament to what free societies can achieve when challenged by aggression, and to the soldiers who operated these weapons with skill and courage through months of brutal combat. Their story deserves to be remembered as an integral part of the larger narrative of World War II history, a chapter in the untold stories of the Second World War that reveals how American innovation and industrial capacity helped win the greatest conflict in human history.